Welcome to Pretty Lies and Alibis. Let's seek the truth and travel the long road to justice together. What you know, Alibiers, happy Tuesday. It's a little late. I apologize for that. Been a busy day. I really haven't been home much. I had a doctor's appointment, got shots for pneumonia and the flu shot. And like 2 hours ago, I started feeling achy. So I think I'm one of those. By the way, funny story. I'm in my doctor's office in the waiting room, and they have a huge TV, like it's big. And they always show nature stuff, like planet Earth. And so the last time I was in there, it showed one animal eating another one, which is another thing that I can't stand seeing because it just breaks my heart. And I know it's the whole circle of life thing, but I don't want to see it. So today I'm sitting there waiting to be called back. What are they showing? Dolphins mating. And the room was packed and there were giggles and snickers. And the old gentleman sitting next to me had quite the puns. Totally awkward. Anyways, so I told my nurse about it when I went back and she was mortified. She was like, we don't really watch that stuff. I'm like, well, you should, because it shows the whole circle of life. Birth to dark, conception to birth to death. Anyways, want to give a big thank you to Jennifer, Wendy, Sharon, and Lori for your donations. I appreciate you. By the way, I can't find the original message. Whoever inboxed me and said that you and your wife listened to the podcast as she gave birth to your baby, please get in touch to me. Gigi at prettyliesandalibis.net. I want to send you guys a baby gift because I love buying baby stuff. All right. Music fact of the day before we jump into this hot mess of a day in the Wagner trial. Cher, her career as a recording artist has spanned 7 decades. She is the only artist to have a #1 single on a Billboard chart in each of the past 6 decades. Love Cher. All right. So we started off the day with Agent Scheider back on Cross. So on Cross, they were talking about the truck photographs, and it was defense attorney Parker up for those. Agent Scheider actually took those pictures last week. And so the defense asks, well, was that after Jake testified? And over a year after the truck was impounded, and he said, you took part in his proffer. And he says, yes. And so the defense attorney says, you didn't take those photos before he got the tremendous plea bargain. And he says, correct. He never showed Jake the photo and didn't take a video of the whole process either. He doesn't know if the tires are the same size as they were the night of the homicides. And then defense attorney Parker says, did you leave the tailgate up for 20, 30, 60 minutes? Did you drive the truck around to see if any exhaust came into the bed of that truck? Did you put any bales of hay on top? No. Did you put any bales of hay to see if the board bent? He says no. And so defense attorney Parker says, do you know how much a bale of hay weighs? And so Scheider was like, well, it depends on what kind. I'm familiar with all kinds of hay. And the defense attorney says it could be 40 pounds each. And he says, yes, depending on what type. Did you find any tire tracks at scene 1 that matched this truck? No. Did you have them going feet first? Yes. Did you videotape that? No. Did you have them crawl out with a weapon, a rifle or a gun? No. Would you agree people carry their weight differently? Some are more muscular, and he literally, y'all, says some are more roly-poly. Yes. So then we go into the Boondock Saints, because this is becoming the Boondock Saints trial. And it says, does either movie deal with a mother figure or a child age 2 who has been sexually assaulted? And he said no. Do the movies involve Facebook messages or a jealous boyfriend whose ex just gave birth to another man's baby? Does the movie have someone looking under the door? Does anyone have an SKS with an oil filter used as a silencer or a Glock? And then Agent Scheider says, yes, the Glock was in there. Does one brother want to strangle his ex and frame the current boyfriend? No. Are there shoes purchased in the movie? No. Do the brothers burn all their clothing in the movie? And he says, yeah, there's a scene where they burn something. Do they cut up the guns and put them in concrete? No. Does the Norman Reedus character lie to his current pastor about his crimes? Scheider says there's a scene where he talks to his pastor, but he doesn't confess. Is there a scene where the murderer smiles and smirks while he testifies in court? No. Now we go to Boondock Saints Part 1. I'm having a marathon this weekend, y'all. Boondock 1, that movie involves 3 Russian mobs going to an Irish bar, and they're going to take over the land and close the bar. The Russians are beat up and humiliated. Scheider says they all ended up dead. Defense attorney says 2 sought revenge and the twin Irish brothers killed them in self-defense. And he's being facetious, but he says a lot like this case. And Scheider says, I don't think I ever heard self-defense mentioned in this case. The defense says, exactly. The media portrays these killers as heroes. Like in this case, no. The police don't charge the twins. Correct. Boondock Saints 2. Fast forward 8 years and they're living a quiet life in Ireland and they're going to be framed for killing a priest. They get on a ship and hide in a container and there's a big shootout with mobsters. The brothers eventually go to prison and there's protesters outside the prison demanding their release. Much like this case. No. They move on to listening devices put in the truck Jake and George drove. So May 24th of 2018, this is about 6 months before the Wagners were arrested. They got the warrant to put the devices in the truck. And in the document, it says, because they have to go before the judge, and there is such a really strict protocol for being able to get these intercept warrants or wiretapping a car. And so in the document, it says they have conducted 500 interviews. They've done over 40 search warrants, 100 subpoenas, 60 extractions from electronics, and 1,000 tips investigated. It says all avenues have been exhausted, and that's why they needed this warrant. The defense says this is kind of a last-ditch effort, right? He was in Parker form today. Everything was, snappy, and he's doing his job, y'all. Scheider said they had enough for an arrest at that point, but not enough for prosecution. And that's a good point. You can arrest somebody, but if you can't get the conviction, then what's the point? Better to wait and do all this stuff. And then that way, when you're at trial, you've got your conviction, hopefully. So the defense shows the affidavit with the probable cause statement, and they talk about the victims, how many times they were shot, autopsies, all that stuff. He gets into information about the Wagner, such as Angela buying the shoes, search warrant, finding the 22 casings that match the crime scenes. They go through this whole document, y'all. Scheider was having to go zen, I'm going to tell you guys, because he does this thing when he's ready to blow his top. I don't know who he looks at, but there's one person he looks at and his eyes kind of get big and he just looks at him and his face gets a little red. Bless his heart. I've noticed that Parker tends to ride him and Julia from BCI pretty hard. It's all stuff we've heard testified to. It's nothing new. So to get Jake and George to talk, one of the ways was you guys served Rita and Angela with a handwriting sample in order to provoke them to talk. And the agent said, this is investigative activity. And you do this when you're on an interception warrant. Absolutely. Defense says you were hoping the current owner of Peterson would alert the Wagners about the search. Kind of sneaky, isn't it? And the prosecution objects, and that's sustained, but everybody kind of laughs. So you talked to Jake's former child custody attorney. You interviewed friends of the Wagners and former church members and coworkers in Alaska in a way to stimulate conversation between Jake and George. He asked about Scheider posing as someone else on topics and posting it in the hopes that Angela would see this and that would provoke conversation. So he asks if the information that Agent Scheider posted was real or fake. And by the way, guys, I have found a Wayback Machine snapshots of topics. My goal when I have time is to go through from the day of the homicides, and I'm going to read as much as they have archived. I'm going to see if I can figure out who Scheider is. I'm going to let you know. I also want to see if I can figure out who Jake and Angela and George are as well. It'll be interesting too to see the progression of the theories and the gossip. I hear it was very active. If anybody knows the name, by the way, of that board or what city it was under, please leave me a message somewhere, gg@prettyliesandalibis.net. It will make my job a lot easier if I know exactly where to go. So the agent explained sometimes it was searches that were public knowledge. And he said, you hoped that would provoke conversation. And the agent said, and it did. He said, I also put false information on there too. And the defense says, is that ethical? You lied. So the defense says, do you have training to know how to recognize behaviors consistent with mental health issues? And the agent says, I was actually one of the first in Ohio to get certified in critical issues. The defense says, what about chronic mental health issues like paranoia over a period of time? And the agent said, I wouldn't consider myself an expert. I can identify someone in a mental health crisis. The defense says, did you notice any behavior in Angela during the investigation? And there's an objection. And the agent said, oh, this is well put. I think there's issues with all 4 people who killed 8 people. So the defense says, are you familiar with confirmation bias? There's a focus on a suspect and you filter evidence to build a conviction or leave out evidence that points away from guilt. And the agent said, it's not something I would do. And then the defense says, are you familiar with the term belief persistence? And there's an objection. The defense says from day one of the investigation to when Jake gave his proffer, there were themes developed by investigators as to why or how these crimes were committed. The agent said the investigation led us in certain directions. Defense says the hair dye was given significance. Jake and George had dyed their hair. The defense says, well, there was some evidence George did. And Scheider said there was evidence. Jake said they didn't dye their hair for the murders. Scheider said, especially he says he thinks Jake tried to minimize George's involvement in his proffer. And the defense says, there you go. It didn't fit your narrative. So Scheider said, I believe it's very suspicious. And you believe custody issues was the motive up until Jake and Angela made their proffer. Scheider said, I still believe that. The defense says, you still believe it? The agent said it was about custody to prevent the sexual assault. So overall, it was about custody. And that's a good point. That's really when people that I talk to about this case now say, oh, it really wasn't about custody, was it? You know what I say? Actually, it kind of was because it comes full circle. The goal was to get Sophia away from the rodents. So yeah, it was. So defense says their explanation under oath doesn't fit your theory, so you reject it. And the agent said it was still about custody. It says, the defense says there was testimony about what Hannah Mae said in that Facebook message. Do you have evidence that Billy saw that? The agent said, I don't remember if Angela said Billy saw it or not. The defense says you remember that Jake's green knife recovered in the concrete. You saw Jake smile and smirk through his testimony. You would agree that there was never any evidence that little Sophie was ever sexually assaulted. And the agent says correct. And the defense points out the only time George was interviewed was in Montana and you never took his cell phone. Is that right? He says, right. He had a different phone actually in Montana than the one he had at the times of the murder. So on redirect, Jake wasn't sure if it was hay or straw in his proffer. Straw is lighter, hay is heavier and used for feed. He watched the men getting in and out of the truck, no issues. Remember, these guys were way bigger, taller than both Jake and George, just to make that point. You were asked about a Glock being used in Boondock Saints. The father uses it. Is there a scene where they drag bodies? And he says yes. Jake testified that the misfire of the Maglite suppressor on the Beretta messed up the barrel. So the prosecution goes through all the things they didn't have in May. The prints, the shoe prints, the interviews. He said they would have done all those things even if they did not need to tickle the wire. Prosecutor says, you're understanding who John Clark was representing. So he says, I know there was Angela and Rita making contact with him. And then the prosecutor said, they accused you of having tunnel vision in this case. How many did you rule out? And he said dozens. They ruled out dozens. So he saw the photo of George and Jake on Facebook feeding animals, and there was testimony about it. I actually put that out on social media the other day. And I will post that on tomorrow's episode. But you clearly see George's hair is very, very dark. Although now it's thin too, but it's really dark. You remember Chris Newcomb made fun of him for it, and so did, I believe, Samantha or somebody from their past. A couple people were like, "What are y'all doing?" So Angela testified she showed the other three Hannah Mae's Facebook message. The phone George had at the border was different, or they would have seized it. So on recross, the defense says, you don't know if it was straw or hay put on top of the truck. The defense says, I believe I already testified no. The defense says, you're allowed to lie to a suspect or the public about an investigation, but the public can't lie to you. And the agent said they can't obstruct an investigation. So we get into wiretap drama, y'all. If there is a visual that I could have done better, but it's late. This would be pretty much what the entire day consisted of past that redirect. It was nasty. They yelled. They got snippy with each other. It was just, it may have been the most intense, explosive day I've ever seen in that courtroom from the first time I've ever seen them in there. And then at one point, you just got Parker. He's giving Angela Canepa just the laser eyes. But I mean, it was just a brawl. All right, so let's get into wiretaps because we didn't get in them today. The whole afternoon consisted of this back and forth between these two sides. So the defense actually had just got a bunch of transcripts right before lunch, and the defense didn't want the jury to get these transcripts of the calls and wiretaps. He said there are some that are very clear to hear, and a transcript is not needed, and I'm so grateful for that, y'all. You just don't even know. Now it's time for our paid sponsor of the week, Everlywell. This year, you can prioritize what matters most when you share the gift of health from Everlywell. Choose from at-home lab tests like food sensitivity, women's health, or men's health, or vitamins and supplements because love and health are all you need. Everlywell is digital healthcare designed for you with personalized results and accessible tools for long-term health. With over 30 at-home lab tests and high-quality vitamins and supplements, you'll be able to find the perfect test for you or your loved one. The women's health, food sensitivity, and celiac disease screening tests are only a few of the options. Here's how it works. Everlywell ships products straight to you or your loved one with everything needed in one package. If you ordered an at-home lab test, the sample can be simply collected at home and shipped back to a certified lab in the prepaid envelope included with the test. Digital, physician-reviewed results are sent straight to your preferred device in just days. If you ordered vitamins and supplements, you can start adding them to your daily routine right away. It's so simple. Over 1 million people have trusted Everlywell to support their health and wellness goals, and now you can help your loved ones do the same. I took the food sensitivity test, which measures your body's immune response to 96 foods to help guide you on what types of food to prioritize in a 2-part elimination diet. The gift of health has never been so easy to share than it is this holiday. For listeners of Pretty Lies and Alibis, Everlywell is offering a discount of 20% off an at-home lab test at everlywell.com/whattheworld. That's everlywell.com/whattheworld for 20% off your next at-home lab test. That's everlywell.com/whattheworld. The state says it would be helpful for the jury to know who is speaking. So Judge Deering says they can use the transcripts. The jury can use the transcripts while listening tomorrow, but they will not have them back in the jury room during deliberations, but they will have the calls. So one conversation is George chastising Jake for not being tougher on Beth Ann about the touching accusations and not believing Sophia. Judge Deering says this call can come in. This will be one we hear tomorrow. In another call, George is asking his grandmother for money. He's waiting on a payout from insurance. That's from when Jake intentionally crashed that truck with Chris Newcomb in the car. The state says that this shows the money is pooled. At the end of the recording, George says he's selling catalytic converters, and the judge says he can't say for sure that they're stolen, and he says it's not relevant and that call cannot come in. The defense wants to keep out a conversation between Beth Ann and Jake. She's groaning about having to live with Angela. It misspelled to algebra. The judge is actually going to allow that one in. There's a conversation that the defense wants all 21 or 22 minutes played in. The state only has provided a 4 to 5 minute clip. The defense says the entire 21 minutes is needed for context. And in this call, George is mad because Sophia is calling Beth Ann mommy. The prosecution says the audio is trimmed down just to the relevant part. Judge Deering said he would rule on that one later. In another recording, George talks about preventing getting in trouble by not caving and crumbling. He also says he's going on the offensive. He's going to allow this one to come in. So this next one involves improper acts and possibly a threat, but it's not a true threat from what the defense says. The defense points out that none of George's charges are for making threats. They note he was on the other side of the country when this was said, so it's not a true threat. The state says that in threatening law enforcement who are investigating the case could be an admission of guilt, and that makes it relevant. In the transcript, George says to Angela, everything you and Dad have ever gotten in trouble for with them mother beepers is because the only reason we never got away with that crap is because somebody caves, everybody crumbles. And I ain't caving and I ain't crumbling. The judge is going to let us hear that one. There's also an attachment sent from George to Angela through the phone. It was sent from George's phone to her. And he and Angela talked about that attachment at a later time on the phone. So the judge is letting both of those come in. The next one, Jake and Angela make plans in case they're both arrested for the murders. George's attorney says it's hearsay. The state says it's proof they made group decisions. The judge says it doesn't come in because George is not heard on that recording. So the next one, George says things about BCI Special Agent Ryan Scheider. The prosecution says he's threatening an investigator and acknowledges that he is being listened to, saying, Ryan, I know you're listening. The judge says the part where George says, Ryan, I know you're listening, can come in, but the ugly thing said about Scheider is a rant, and it can't come in. He said it could be prejudicial. FYI, Agent Scheider had to have security placed at his home once these threats were heard over the wires, by the way. I bet that was a scary time for him and his family. All right, so the next one, George and Chris Newcomb talking about the Olympics, which is a word they used in code for poaching. George mentions that he thought they would be arrested right before the election. DeWine was running. Judge will rule later. He doesn't remember Jake testifying to this. The next one, a threats made against law enforcement. Jake and Angela and George are in this one in a truck. And it says, but Ryan, I want to kill him. There's also a discussion about steering law enforcement off track with Jake saying, I don't know why they have a vengeance against us. And that's trying to throw law enforcement off track. Judge Deering will allow that to come in. Okay, so this is the one that started the big old fight. All right. I'm going to tell you guys, this is a trial and it's an ugly trial. We have 8 human beings who've lost their life. And I feel bad for laughing about things when it's in trial, but I'm going to tell you right now, y'all, I laughed so hard at this. It was crazy. Okay, big old fight. State says there's evidence of George, Jake, and Angela discussing Sophia's welfare with Beth there. By the way, let's get started. Time to fight. Okay, so George's paranoia is evident in this recording, and the conversation was regarding Beth and Sophia, and the state says it shows the common scheme. She quotes, when it's dark, I want you, Vine, and Beth to go in the room, lock the door, and keep that thing with you. Prosecutor Canepa says things like this is it's their entire case. When you start listening to these, you see how they treated Tabby, Hannah Mae, and now Beth, and George was a big part of that. The defense says there was never any harm done to Beth, and prosecutor Canepa said, well, yeah, it's because she left. Defense attorney Parker says they gave her a ride. Prosecutor says it's the state's theory of the case, and the defense says, I'm talking about the evidence. The evidence is they gave her a ride so she could leave, not that she fled. The whole reason was George was convinced Beth Ann was going to sell Sophia and Vine into the sex trade. That's what Canepa said, by the way. Defense attorney Parker says that hasn't been testified to, and the prosecution says, well, it's going to come in. That's what these are. In fact, on one of these, George tells Jake, you can leave, but she stays, and I'll protect her because you want. So defense attorney Parker says, so he doesn't want his niece with a woman he suspects of being a child molester. Prosecutor Canepa says, just like he didn't want his niece with the Rodens. Prosecutor Andy Wilson gets in and he says, and they're willing to kill Beth. Both defense attorneys jump up and say, that's not fair. That's not in here. Did they have disagreements? Yeah, because Sophie told Angela she was inappropriately touched. And I wonder what happens when George finds out it was allegedly happening at the Rodens. So that's how that exchange went. Is the defense said, did they have disagreements? Yeah, because Sophie told Angela she was inappropriately touched. Then we go back to the prosecutor, Andy Wilson, and he says, and I wonder what happened when George found out it was allegedly happening at the Rodens. That was how that went down. They were just slinging mud at this point, y'all. Defense attorney Parker says it's a huge leap from protecting to killing. Prosecution says, that's your closing argument. And Parker says, and that's the flaw in your case. Dude. Oh, man, they were not mincing words. And I'm going to tell you, the judge just sat back there and looked. Canepa says it's not a flaw. And that's what we had Jake and Angela testify to. And Angela said the protection of Sophia was very much a part of George's motive. The state's theory is that George considers protecting Sophia his responsibility. Defense attorney Nash says at some point this becomes cumulative and unnecessary. Canepa says cumulative and unnecessary. What other evidence has come other than from the co-defendant so far? So the judge is going to let that conversation in. That whole argument was around that one. But it's a good point she makes, and it's one I was thinking about. What other evidence has come other than from the co-defendant so far? So that's been my whole point. If it hadn't have been for Jake and Angela confessing and testifying against George, there would have been nothing at all, I don't think, against George. I mean, it's clear he was there. I think he'll get charged, but still, the shoe evidence really didn't work out. I know the defense is flying in a witness that is in forensics. I think the prosecution closes tomorrow, by the way. So it'll be interesting to see. But even the shoe experts said, can't say George wore them. No fingerprints, no DNA at the scene. You got the word of two people who are going to one's going to spend his entire life in jail. And if she's lucky, maybe get out at 84 or something like that. So, yeah, just something to think about, So the judge lets that in, and then they talk about George in R&L truck speaking about Beth. The prosecution said, this is the exact same thing, Your Honor. Defense attorney Nash says, then if it's cumulative, we've had 3 or 4 of the same ones. So George says, prosecutor Canepa points out in this recording, George says the only ones you basically have are Vine, Suds, Mom, me, and Dad. That it's no matter what it is or who's that, we are the only ones you can count on, essentially. And that's what she's trying to do. Is the defense has consistently said that George was trying to get away from the family. He wanted to get away from the family. And what the prosecution's doing is they are showing the jury that George never gave any indication he wanted to leave, and that he was very much in on every aspect of everybody's life. I think it's what you have to do. You have to convince that jury that George wasn't having second thoughts about anything. And this is how you do it. So George says, and Canepa says, he wasn't trying to get away from his family like you said he was in his opening statement. So defense attorney Parker says opening statements aren't evidence. And so Canepa says, but we have to prove they're incorrect. And that's what this does. And you wouldn't be objecting if it wasn't dangerous to your case. So defense attorney Nash says, look, we're just trying to save time. The judge is going to let it in. So there's a conversation between George and Angela. It's not clear what they're talking about, so it's irrelevant, according to the defense. The prosecution says it's the writings of Beth Ann's that Rita says she found in the trash. Defense attorney Nash says because only writings go in the trash. What are they talking about? And prosecutor said, I just told you. And Nash says, because you were there? The judge doesn't allow this in, by the way, says you have to read a lot more into the conversation than what it has into it. So it's not coming in. There's a recording of Angela and Jake talking about Tabitha's Facebook. Defense attorney doesn't understand the relevance. So the prosecution says Angela's telling Jake she wants him to ask George for Tabitha's password so she can monitor it. The judge is going to allow that in. There is a voicemail. No message was left, but a voice is heard saying, Jake, you've got nothing to worry about. The judge isn't letting that come in. There's a recording of Jake on the phone from R&L wanting to come home for a family emergency. And that was, I believe, was that when they texted the picture of the gun, Jake holding 1911? I think so. Defense attorney Nash said it's been testified to. Prosecutor says it's been offered to show their reaction to Ryan texting the photo of Jake holding the 1911. Jake testified to it. That's coming in. That'll be interesting to hear. I'd like to hear his voice. How does he sound? Does he sound nervous? Does he sound very, just emotionless like he did on the stand? So there's another recording. Angela complains that Beth may have poisoned them. Defense attorney says the state has the testimony. They want to drive home the point, right? So prosecutor Canepa says George says she's putting some kind of drug in their stuff. And if they do arrest us, they'll find drugs in our system, which essentially is George buying into the paranoia. He always talks about papers. He also talks about papers for the kids' custody if they all get arrested. Nash says that's a far cry from murder. The prosecutor says, well, one wouldn't think murder would happen over what it did, so this is highly relevant to that. The way they treat these girls is the same. They accuse them of poisoning. They accuse them of trying to get the kids from them. They isolate them. He's buying what his mom is selling, just like they did when they decided to murder the Rodens. George knows about it and believes it, so the judge is going to let that in. There's something about Jake, that picture again, holding 1911. The prosecutor, George knows that occurred when George falsely saying this isn't Jake's hand when he knows, and she said, darn well it is. It's part of the conspiracy and cover up because he knew they were listening to them when he said that isn't Jake's hand. The judge is going to let that one in. In another recording, the prosecutor said the opening line is relevant. The family has spoken. She's not living nowhere near us, and knowing where me, mom, and Vine live. This is a family decision. So the judge lets that in. Another recording, the defense attorney says this is George saying he wants a ribeye steak. And the prosecutor says Angela is telling Jake to tell George he has to stop drinking caffeine because he's going to screw up, because he talks too much when he's on caffeine. And defense attorney Nash says talks too much. I think he's kind of pointing at her way. The judge does not let that in. Next recording, defense attorney Nash says it contains threats and is prejudicial. Prosecutor Canepa says this is regarding us serving subpoenas to get their shoe and palm prints. I don't know that he ruled on that one. The next recording, George is referencing an attorney saying he wants a restraining order against BCI. The prosecutor says also wants to smash Ryan's head. His mom reminds him, we're listening. This isn't a conversation with an attorney. It shows a group response. So the defense says this is more of a rant. The prosecution says he's going to visit Ryan. This is an indication of guilt and them talking about the investigative activities that we were doing at that time. Defense attorney Parker says it has to be relevant and probative of a disputed fact. And prosecutor Canepa says, we think it's probative of the fact that he was in the thick of it. So Parker says he knows his family is under investigation at that point. And Angela Canepa says he's saying what he wants to do with all the lead agents on the case. So I don't think the judge is going to let that one in. There was a recording of Jake and George arguing over whose kid hit who first. It's not coming in. Jake said he bought the Captain America mask for George on the same day he bought other things for the homicides. That's coming in. So there's some text from Billy, a photo of a 1911 from Jake's phone. Billy was trying to find it, and Billy asks Angela, who asked George and Jake? I think that is going to be in response to the text they got when they were on the road. They have a family emergency. They tell Billy about it. And then he's trying to find this photo. And he also asks, George and Jake about that. Because it said, I need you to come in and talk to me. So that was the day, y'all. It was lots of back and forth, lots of laser eyes. A few times you could see the few people who stuck around for it laughing. So tomorrow was actual wiretap day, y'all. So we get to hear it. We get to hear some of the things we've been waiting on. I've heard the wiretaps are supposed to be explosive. These are things that they just still had to rule on. I don't understand why this wasn't decided way before today. It did make for a little entertaining afternoon session, though. All right, guys, we will see you tomorrow evening. May do too, though. Honestly, wiretaps can be hard to do, and they tend to make me go late if they're hard to hear. So if I have enough at lunch, I'll throw one episode out and then do the rest, the afternoon session, in a second one. All right, guys, we'll see you tomorrow. Ding, ding, ding.